This past weekend was a weekend to celebrate living legends. Both Saenchai and Buakaw were able to walk away with impressive knockout victories. Welcome to Kick Weekly with Tim Wheaton. I'll be your host, Tim Wheaton, where we're covering all the latest news and fights in the world of kickboxing. Let's start with the Muay Thai legend Saenchai at the tender age of 43. Got a head kick knockout victory in the very first round. This makes it 328 victories in his professional career. When is he going to stop? When is this legend going to ever retire? He has been kind of on the retirement trail fighting foreigners for quite a while now, for more than a decade. So 2014, he fought a Thai person in Rajadamnern Stadium, and that was kind of the last time that he took a match against a Thai person. Since then, he's just been fighting foreign fighters in Muay Thai, putting on impressive shows, fights that he should be winning. It's just impressive that he's been doing it for 10 years. In Muay Thai, people compete for such a long time, starting usually at 7 years old, that by the time they hit 30, they're looking to retire because they have injuries or whatever it might be, or they just don't want to compete anymore because it's a brutal sport. Saenchai's out here, since he was like 33 years old, being like, screw it, I'm going on a retirement tour. I'm just going to show up and do fun fights against foreigners. And then he looks good doing it. So this past weekend, he got another head kick knockout victory. Congratulations to him. Looked great doing it. And it just continues. Like, he's been technically unbeaten in Muay Thai since about 2014. This adds to his huge win streak that he has going on. But yeah, he's a living legend. He didn't quite compete during the golden era of Muay Thai, and that's the knock against his all-time great status. He would very easily be an all-time great if he competed with those same records 10 years earlier. But he was kind of at the tail end of the golden era in the early 2000s. So his opponents were maybe not the best quality. It wasn't, there's a reason that was not the golden era. So he was able to pick up a ton of stadium titles between Lumpini and Rajadamnern and WBC and tons of other stuff like that. But given the competition, that's why you don't see Saenchai always ranked as one of the all-time greats in Muay Thai. He certainly is somewhere on the top 10 list, most likely, and this legacy has really made it fun. But top 5 would not be correct. Let's say that. At Rizin Landmark 9, the legendary Buakaw was able to get a second round knockout victory against Minoru Philip Kimura. And the first round, especially the first minute, was more or less what I expected from this fight, because I said Minoru Philip Kimura should win this fight very easily. He should have no problem winning this fight. He is a fighter still very much in his prime. He hits hard. He is a 2020 K1 Grand Prix winner. He's coming off a couple of wins. They were changed to no contests for reasons. But ultimately, this should be an easy fight for Minoru Kimura. And he is a legendary hitter in terms of how hard he hits. Something like an over 80% knockout win rate. When he won the K1 Grand Prix in 2020, they were all by first round knockout. And in the first round of his fight against Buakaw, you saw essentially how he fights. He was throwing flurries in combination, mixing low to high punches. And every punch, whether it was blocked or landed, had an impact sound. You could tell it was making a difference against Buakaw. And the punches that land made Buakaw stumble. And that's what I was expecting for most of the fight. And then around 2 minutes after the first round, things changed. Kimura got tired, or Buakaw was able to see these combinations coming and change his game plan because of it. Buakaw was able to use the jab and then convert into clinching a little bit more, closing the distance, but mainly he got to the front foot and was the aggressor. And once he became the aggressor and pushing Kimura back, Minoru Philip Kimura struggled to get back from that. And then early in the second round, Kimura was throwing great punches, but same thing happened. Buakaw was able to get a couple of clinches going, was able to land a couple of punches, was able to become the aggressor, and then he landed a clean 1-2, just like that, and put Kimura down. Kimura fell asleep and was not able to recover. So at 41 years old, Buakaw is still competing, still considered a large. Buakaw is still a legend, an all-time great in kickboxing for a reason. His technique, his skill level for his age is absolutely outstanding. And it's a person that's extra impressive because he's been out of his prime for more than 10 years. Like, even, the two that 2004 to 2006, maybe 2008 K1 run was really the prime time for Buakaw. I mean, maybe up to 2009 or 2010 kind of thing. He's fighting Giorgio Petrosian, Masato Kobayashi, Andy Sauer, just like the legends of legends, golden era of K1 Max kickboxing. And then after that, things start falling apart for him. And he is a legend, and he will sell out stadiums in Thailand and stuff like that. And he's still a name that people tune in for. But from like arguably 2010 to now, he's been out of his prime, and yet he's still putting on huge, impressive fights. He's still been doing very impressive things in that era. For the last little while, he's been doing mix of fights, some exhibitions, some professional, some Muay Thai, some kickboxing, some bare knuckle stuff. They hear stuff here and there, just essentially whoever wants to pay, whether it's BKFC, whether it's like a Thai fight promotion, or whether it's Rizin or RWS or whatever it might be. He's just kind of on the, the tail end retirement tour, making some money right now. But this was, of his opponents over the last 3 years or so, this was one of the tougher opponents, and an opponent that he really rightfully should have lost to. So him getting a knockout against Minoru Philip Kimura, that's actually very impressive. That's a big deal. And it's extra impressive because he was getting beat up and had to push just to survive. So it shows that there's still a hunger there for him. And after the fight, no surprise that Buakaw said that this was the hardest puncher in my entire career. And he's fought major hard hitters like Mike Zambides and tons of other people, like, you're the legendary John Wayne Pars and John Charles Skarbowski and tons of others. Anyone who was essentially a name in those weight classes over the last 15 years, Buakaw has probably fought him. And he said that Minoru Philip Kimura hit harder than any of them. And that's not a surprise in any way. We're not surprised by that kind of thing. Minoru Philip Kimura, that's why we made on Beyond Kickboxing a highlight reel video saying that this is the hardest puncher pound for pound in kickboxing is Minoru Philip Kimura. He's like, 155 pounds and knocking out everybody. He's not a heavyweight swinging and banging. He is a crisp striker who throws impressive flurries that flatlines people. And arguably, he should still be in his athletic prime. He is just coming off of the K1 Grand Prix victory a couple of years ago. He had some wins in 2023, 2024. He's not too far out of his prime. He should still be in his prime very much. But Buakaw was able to win by knockout. Absolutely legendary performance. Now, what's next for Buakaw? So the K1 Max 2024 Grand Prix, 155 pounds, does have one wild card in it. I fully expect Buakaw to be that wild card. Apparently they were in discussion or are in discussion or negotiating. I don't know how far along in the progress they are, but adding Buakaw to that tournament, obviously he gets beat by anybody in that tournament. No question about it. But I picked Kimura over him and I was wrong. So me saying all 8 of these guys should beat him, maybe I'm incorrect about that. Maybe he actually does beat a couple of these people and then lose in the final. And that would be very cool. That would be very interesting. That would be very fun. But it adds some weight to the tournament. It adds a very big name to the tournament because a lot of kickboxing fans or casual kickboxing fans don't know who Ouyang Feng is. Ouyang Feng probably wins the whole tournament, or Kasper Mushinski or someone like that. No one, outside of the circle of kickboxing, not a lot of people really know who those people are, but everybody knows Buakaw. So back in the day, people don't realize how if you're getting into kickboxing today, how K1 kickboxing was a frontline sport during the early and mid 2000s. And I don't just mean in Japan. Obviously, during the Kogataki boom, K1 was massive. And on TV, K1 was constantly beating Pride in TV ratings. Consistently beating Pride in TV ratings. Essentially, Pride was the second show in Japan after K1. And stateside, people always talked about K1, and stateside, people also always talked about UFC versus Pride. That was the thing to talk about. That was the only thing to talk about, essentially, is all we did is talk about K1 versus, that was the only thing to talk about was Pride versus the UFC. But also at the same time, on those same forums, K1 got tons of coverage. K1 got mainstream coverage on every MMA website because it was a frontline sport. In MMA media today, we really only talk about the UFC, Bellator a little bit, PFL a little bit, KSW, Octagon. They all fall, into the other categories, Rizin to an extent. But if you go on any MMA website today, 99% of it is going to be UFC coverage, but not even all of it's going to be everything the UFC does. A lot of these websites don't bother covering every fight at the apex. And so, to put it into perspective of what the media would look like back in the mid 2000s when you had K1 Pride and the UFC is that Pride and UFC would get most coverage, and then K1 would get like more than Bellator gets today. So if you have a person who's like, a Pride boomer on the Sherdog forum, and like me too, I'm there. People call these dorks out of like, oh, those are Pride boomers from the Sherdog forum. Yeah, I know. That's me. I get it. You don't have to call me out. You can just say my name. Buakaw kicking that banana tree in half was one of the top posts on Sherdog for a while. Like, this was a huge deal. Him getting the cut, it got mainstream coverage. And it was no problem to stream these events or download these events because of how big of a deal they were. But yeah, essentially, I kind of lost the plot there for a minute. But yeah, the big three always were UFC and Pride and K1. And K1, during its prime era, was bigger than both of those, arguably. But MMA took over. And I was talking about this with Luke Thomas recently, and we were talking about why kickboxing has kind of fallen to the wayside when it was a golden egg of the Kogataki boom. And it was a big deal stateside as well for people who followed. If you followed the UFC and Pride, you also followed K1. No question about it. And the reason is, like, there's lots of different complex reasons that we can talk about, like Spike TV and Glory and promoting in Europe rather than blah, 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 rather than this. And then you have TV deals falling apart because of this, and, just couldn't be on international TV or couldn't be on local TV, blah, blah, blah. Most of it is just because MMA dominance. That's at the end of the day, is that people got a taste for MMA, and that was the mainstream combat sport. And that's how it still is largely today, like ongoing. It is just MMA dominance. If you are a young man growing up in Japan, or a young man growing up in the Netherlands, or a young man growing up in Morocco, you're probably going to turn to MMA before you turn to kickboxing. And, you can't blame these people. Most people in kickboxing and Muay Thai are following their dreams to try to be kickboxers. Whereas if you really do want income and to make a career, honestly, yeah, like MMA makes sense. I don't blame you at all for that. That makes perfect sense. I've known people, that have won titles in Japan, and they still lost money because they still had to pay their managers and gym fees and trainers and all that sort of stuff. You really have to go into kickboxing because you love it. Anyway, where was I? What were we talking about here? Oh, yeah, the other thing I was going to talk about, this happened a few weeks ago, but it's kind of a funny story. And Dogman pulled this out. And Dogman's a legend of kickboxing. He was the host of a podcast about kickboxing. Great voice, great research writer, and great writer overall. Who he actually is, can't wait to find out. But he apparently, so the reason, let's go back a little bit here. So K1 did their rebirth era, and they were on DAZN. It was announced that they were on DAZN. And that was for international audience, and Michael Schiavella was on it. And it was on DAZN over and over and over again. And then just a few hours before broadcast, all of that was pulled without any word as to why. And we didn't know anything. We still don't really know a ton. But for the past decade, the K1 International trademark has bounced around to different owners in that time. So K1 World Grand Prix can broadcast in Japan with no problems. But K1 cannot, or did not, or was not able to broadcast internationally because their international trademark was not owned by them. It was owned by somebody else. And it bounced around to different stuff. Like Glory tried to buy it at one point, I think, but they didn't want to sell it. So Glory got the library essentially. But the international trademark was bounced around. I think a Shanghai real estate firm owned it for a while. Like, it just became an asset in people's investment portfolio. And that's why if you're hosting a kickboxing event, you can get the K1 name on it. If it's amateurs, or if you're opening a gym, you can get the K1 name on it, and you had to apply for a license through some random Shanghai real estate website, essentially. And I believe that was sold to somebody else and sold to somebody else and kind of bounced around a bit. Doesn't fully matter for where we're going here. But ultimately, some firm in New York now owns that trademark. And they found out about K1 going live internationally on DAZN. So they issued a cease and desist to DAZN and said, you absolutely cannot do that because we own the trademark. K1 countered them and said, no, we actually do own the trademark. So now the two are going to court. But how that international firm found out about the K1 Grand Prix going international was through my article. It was my fault. Why isn't K1 on DAZN? It's because of me. I'm sorry. I did my best to report on this stuff, and I ruined it for everybody. So K1 for the past decade could not broadcast internationally. They were all set up to broadcast internationally. We were all excited. And who shut it down? Me. It was me. So the article has actually been entered into the New York judicial system as at this point. I think it's Exhibit F officially, but you can see my article with my name on it, and it has the court filings around the outside, and Dogman sent it all over to me, and Dogman found all this stuff out. So it's been, but yeah, essentially K1, I think just is countering them and saying like, no, we actually did buy it. We believe that we bought it and there should be no wrongdoing. The other firm really isn't a fight firm. It's not like the UFC or you know, how the UFC owns Pride kind of thing, or how the UFC owns WEC and whatever. It is just like some random investment firm who doesn't know exactly what K1 is, believing that they own the international copyright. So now they're going to court, and where that happened, where that goes, none of us have any clue. We don't know what that is going to end up being. But essentially, they found out about it because of me. Officially, Beyond Kickboxing and Tim Wheaton fucked it up. So anytime that you say, why isn't kickboxing on DAZN? Why isn't K1 on international TV? It's because of Tim. You're welcome. All right, let's go to a break. And then when we come back, we're going to cover some more combat sports. Thank you for listening to the Calf Kick Sports Network. Make sure to check out more interviews, highlights, and podcasts on the interview channels. Additionally, make sure to check out Calf Kick Sports on Instagram. Links for all of these will be down below. Now, back to the show. So it's not a huge week for kickboxing, and it's not a huge week for MMA as well. So I'm not going to talk about much about either of those right now. Essentially, that's the first half. And then when we're going to move forward and talk about the sport that I've had actually lots of success in is sumo wrestling. So back in 2021, I made some videos on sumo wrestling that are still my most watched videos of all time. Like I really do talk about mainly MMA, kickboxing, and Muay Thai, and yet all of my work in that industry has not beat how much I was covering sumo wrestling. So like some of those sumo wrestling videos, very surprisingly, did over 250,000 to 300,000 views. My stuff in MMA and kickboxing and Muay Thai does not beat that. So really, if it's just based on numbers and results, I need to cover sumo wrestling more. And I wrote some very good articles about sumo wrestling as well. But it is a matter of I'll pay attention to sumo wrestling when there's interesting things going on. And back in 2021, there was a lot of interesting things going on. And then in 2024, more fascinating things are happening. So I'll talk a little bit about sumo wrestling. If you know some stuff already, great. Make sure to keep me on track, because I'm by no means I'm not an expert in sumo wrestling. I'm just a fan who's kind of covering it. So, you know, every once in a while we get things incorrect, and that's okay. Annually, there are 6 tournaments in sumo wrestling, and it's not like they lead to a final tournament or anything like that, or there's like a year-end tournament where that's the big one. Each of the 6 tournaments have equal value for winning a grand championship. So over 15 days, every sumo wrestler will take 1 match per day, and it's kind of a tournament it's not an elimination tournament system. It's more of a point tournament system. So sometimes in the final match of the tournament are not the people who win, or like, you know, stuff happens because it's more point based, but like most of the time you kind of get the final 2 people, you know, against each other in the end, sumo wrestling. There are 6 major divisions, starting from the lowest division. You have Jonkuchi, Jondian, Sandamni, and those are like kind of you're building up. You're maybe a bit younger, but in those leagues, you're barely getting paid, or some of them you're not getting paid anything. And then we go to Makushita, Juryo, and then the highest division is Makuchi. And in those divisions, you're making much better money, especially if you're in the Makuchi division, which is the highest division. So that's the elite division that you want to be paying attention to if you're getting into sumo, is the Makuchi division. And this year, some history was made. For the first time in a century, a debuting fighter in the Makuchi division won the entire championship. He won the tournament. The Japanese-born Takerufuji was able to win a championship, making his debut in the Makuchi division. And this is the first time this has been done since like 1915 or something like that. Just an absolutely shocking upset. He was the lowest ranked fighter in the tournament and won the entire thing, and did a very impressive job doing it. So over 15 matches, he had 13 wins and 2 losses. And that's very typical. It's very rare that a sumo wrestler will win the championship unbeaten. And that's why in 2021, it was a really big deal. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But most of the time, the winner of the tournament drops a few here and there, but largely But the crazy thing is that he was the lowest ranked fighter in the tournament, and the day before the final, he lost a match and injured his ankle so badly that he required a wheelchair to be carried out of the arena. His trainers, his manager, everyone in his stable said, pull out of the tournament, recover your body. There's no reason to take a risk tomorrow. And he said, no, I'm going to compete in the thing tomorrow. So he competed with the injured ankle, lowest ranked fighter in the tournament, making his debut in the Mikuchi division, and won. Absolutely stunning. He said, I injured a ligament in my right ankle on day 14. My stable master told me to pull out, but I knew I would regret it for the rest of my life. And if you ever ask me to do it again, there's no way I would be able to. My body moved instinctively. I wasn't even conscious of it. I did this through sheer willpower alone. And then he said, I didn't really know what was going on. Incredible. Incredible story here. The 24-year-old Takerufuji was able to win a championship, making his debut in the highest division. And he certainly is a great sumo wrestler. So in his last tournament, he won the Juryo division. Before that, he was doing quite well in the lower divisions, but essentially he slowly worked his way up into the highest division and was able to win. In sumo wrestling, it is very rare that you will get a legacy kind of fighter who has a generation of dominance because of how injury prone these people are. Tournaments are very hard. People tear ligaments all the time. It's, typical that you will injure your knee or ankle or anything like that and pull out of the tournament, or just half-ass compete because you're injured. So there's a tournament there's 6 tournaments per year, and it's every 2 months. And then for 2 weeks straight, you have to compete every day. It's very typical that if you have an injury, it will just get worse and worse and worse. So, but if you take time off and say, I need time to recover, well, then you're not getting paid. So there's kind of a cyclical loop there. Sumo Stew on YouTube, which I think many of you are probably already a fan of already, and if you're not, you should be, had a great video about sumo wrestlers need to take an injury break, because statistically the fighters that take injury breaks do much better. And I know that's not a surprise, but there are statistics backing this up. But it is a matter of saying, take a break and not get paid. That kind of sucks. That's hard to do. So so let's back up here a little bit. What was going on in 2021 and why was that such a big deal? But you had 2 arguably all-time greats. Hakuho is the greatest of all time, the greatest sumo wrestler of all time from when this began being tracked. There is a lot of legends in sumo. And then there was more of a sumo period where things are actually being tracked. And I'll talk about that and I'll tell you all about it. But for the period where things are actually being tracked, Hakuho by far is the greatest sumo wrestler of all time. And in the finals in 2021, he faced Terunofuji. And Terunofuji is among the all-time greats. Right now, he is considered the greatest sumo wrestler kind of who is active. So he won most of the tournaments in 2023 and 2022 kind of thing. And he was a person who took an injury break. But you can see him in matches. He comes in with like 2 knee braces because he's so injured. But he took Terunofuji's story is kind of incredible because he took a major injuries and went to the very lowest division of sumo wrestling and then worked his way back to the highest level of sumo wrestling and won some tournaments. And no one has ever done that before. So he was at the highest level. He was demoted to the lowest level. And then came back and won the entire thing. So the equivalent of Terunofuji's story is someone is playing in the MLB World Series and then gets demoted to high school baseball, and then works their way back to the World Series and then wins it. So Terunofuji has an incredible story. But in 2021, Terunofuji and Hakuho met in the finals. And this is why it's such a big deal. I was saying, you don't go undefeated in these tournaments. Both of these guys were 14-0 coming into the final. This was for all the marbles. And they were rivals before. They had faced each other several times before. And in the end, Yokozuna Hakuho won. And it was really exciting. And it was a back and forth. It was a quick match. I think it was 20 seconds or so, which is quite long in sumo wrestling. But it was a really exciting match and he was able to win it. And by far, he is an all-time great. But the interesting part is that both Hakuho and Terunofuji, so Hakuho retired and then Terunofuji was able to become the top ranked guy. But the reason that Hakuho and Terunofuji are so interesting, they went undefeated. They were clearly a cut above the rest of the competition. Both had fallen behind because of injuries and worked their way back up. It's very interesting. Hakuho retired, Terunofuji took over. Both are Mongolian. And that's very typical in sumo wrestling. We think of sumo wrestling as being an ancient Japanese sport, and it is. And it's even tied to their Shinto gods. So sumo wrestling itself is considered a Shinto ceremony. So it is a religious ceremony, very much tied to their ancient gods. And I was talking to people in Japan about how they view religion, and Japan says we are 3 religions. And a lot of it has to do with the history that they didn't have some philosophical ideas until it was introduced to them, and then they just adopted the best of that. And like people will want to correct me in the comments, but this is from talking to people in Japan when I was visiting there. But they said something like, we didn't have much of an idea of an afterlife until Buddhism showed up. We had an idea of like kind of forest gods or fire gods and stuff like that, and that's Shinto. But then Buddhism showed up, and then we started talking about the afterlife. And then we didn't have many ideas on marriage until Christianity showed up. So in Japan, they have a saying of like, you're born Shinto, you're married Christian, and you die Buddhist. So anyway, like do Japanese people celebrate much Shinto or Christianity or Buddhism? And the answer is kind of and not really. They don't do a lot of it, and then they do a little bit here and there. But anyway, so sumo wrestling is an ancient Japanese sport. So how did Mongolia come to take it over? So Japan did not allow any foreigners to compete in sumo wrestling for centuries, for such a long time. But they had a post-war economic boom happen, and that's when you saw all their tech stuff starting to come together. They had major multinational billion-dollar industries coming together, and because of that, people didn't want to compete in sumo because it is a really hard lifestyle. You live in a stable. If you're lower ranked, you essentially cook and clean for the higher ranked members. Every day you're wrestling and fighting in the sand pits. And like I was saying, if you're in the lower leagues, you're not getting paid. If you're in the higher leagues, you're probably getting injured, but you're getting paid a little bit. That's a really hard lifestyle. So if you're a younger person growing up in Japan at that time in the late 80s or mid 80s, sumo wrestling is not a very appealing career compared to going into tech or business or something like that, where you can make money right away and it's safer and you're not putting your body on the line. Makes sense. Of course, that makes a lot of sense. And they really fell by the wayside. So Yokozuna, so if you're competing in the Mikuchi division, you get rankings, and Yokozuna is the highest ranking. And it's kind of an honorary title to say that you are among the all-time greats in this sport. And you also represent kickboxing very well outside of the ring. And since 1998, there has only been one Yokozuna from Japan. And so most of them have actually been from Mongolia. From 2007 to 2015, there were 48 tournaments, and none of them were from Japan. Sorry, none of the winners were from Japan in that time. And even since 2015 to today, I have here, when I wrote this article, 33 tournaments had happened and only 13 of the victors were from Japan. And since the 80s, so they were struggling to get people from Japan to even compete in it. It's actually a little bit better than it was today. But at the time, in the mid 80s, they had to start recruiting elsewhere. And the first few places that they looked were Hawaii and Samoa and places like this. And then they ended up getting some very, very good people like Akibon Otaro, who also fought Bob Sapp and stuff like that. You have Musa Shimaru, who's another legend. Both became Yokozuna. And around 1992, Japan is still looking for more and more people to go into sumo. Because again, even if you go to Hawaii or Samoa, it is still a very hard sell to say, come into sumo. You might make no money, but you will be injured at the end of it. Even if you're successful, you're going to be injured at the end of it. So in 1992, they opened and started searching in Mongolia. And there are a lot of articles about why Mongolia has come to dominate sumo wrestling. And a little bit, people love to talk about Mongolian genetics and how they are raised. And I do think that's an interesting factor to it. So, a lot of articles say like Mongolia breeds good sized people naturally, and then they're raised quite often on herding farms. So they're always carrying cattle and carrying things around like that. And yeah, I think that's an interesting part of it. I do. But I think the larger part is that everyone participates in bok, which is a style of wrestling, which is quite similar to sumo wrestling. So most of the great sumo wrestlers actually started in bok. And you can look it up and you can see it. But you probably have seen highlights if you're in the combat sports community. That's where Mongolians wear the hat and kind of the back piece and the arms are covered and stuff like that. The rules are very similar. But if you are attending school in Mongolia, you will participate in bok. And I think that's why, more than genetics or farming, I think that's the main reason why Mongolia has come to dominate sumo. and for economic reasons. Japanese people, for economic reasons, don't want to participate in sumo, but for a person who's born and raised in Mongolia who doesn't have any career prospects, the pay is actually quite good for someone like that. So in 2021, I was writing that the average wage for a Mongolian is $380 per month, whereas opportunities as a sumo wrestler can earn a person much more, even with a grueling lifestyle. Depending on one's rank in sumo, as I was talking about the 6 ranks, depending on one's rank in sumo, a wrestler can earn anywhere from $10,000 per month to $25,000 per month. And then you can earn more in tournaments if you win more prizes. So again, the average wage in Mongolia is $300 per month. And then in sumo wrestling, you can earn $10,000 to $25,000. That's worth the opportunity right there. The sumo wrestling announcer had said that most people who come from Japan to take up sumo come from poor families. So they have a big, hungry spirit to succeed and support their family back at home. And then if you do win and do very well as a Mongolian sumo wrestler, you do get national fame in Mongolia. And you have the opportunity to come back a hero and have the opportunity to do even more. So a lot of Mongolian sumo wrestlers who retire go back to Mongolia and, go into politics or become real estate developers or anything like that. But yeah, they are considered a very, very famous person. But now, how does Japanese people view foreigners coming into their sport? And look, if you ask 10 different people, you're going to get 10 different answers. And my opinion on it simply does not matter. So when I wrote this article back in 2021, I asked people in Japan who cover sumo what their opinion on it is. So I talked to Sumo Soul, Ichiro Sumo, and Sumo Follower, all of which are major people who cover sumo wrestling in Japan. And I spoke to them on Twitter. Sumo Soul when I spoke to him, he had said, I think the idea that many have that Japanese are against non-Japanese wrestlers or Yokozuna grand champions, whether Mongolian or not, is overblown. The average Japanese sumo fan has no real problem with a foreign Yokozuna, but it's only natural that they also want to see a Japanese wrestler ascend to that level, as it is a sport that has existed in Japan for over 1,000 years. Ichiro Sumo told me, he said, enthusiastic sumo fans are accepting of Mongolian wrestlers because they practice very well and speak Japanese. We cannot enjoy sumo wrestling without them. Of course, we Japanese want Japanese wrestlers to be strong too. And Sumo Follower said Japanese sumo fans have a varying view on foreigners in sumo, ranging from give us back our national sport to Mongolians are great, the more the better. I think most are somewhere in the middle, love seeing a rikishi from their home prefecture, but appreciate professionals when they see them. So again, it really depends on the person you speak to. There's not a unanimous opinion on foreigners taking over their national sport. But yeah, like I was saying, from 2007 to 2015, no one from Japan won. And even today, it's very rare that someone from Japan will win, which let's loop back to Takerufuji is a Japanese-born sumo wrestler. And including 2023 and 2024, I think there's been about 8 tournaments, and I think 2 of them were won by Japanese people. So it's a very big deal that Takerufuji won, lowest ranked, first time in 100-some years that someone has done that. And so sumo wrestling is a Shinto religion, and its legends, they talk about Shinto gods engaging in sumo wrestling. And what that exactly is not entirely clear, because the word sumo kind of just means wrestling in my understanding. So were the Shinto gods doing this exact sumo wrestling? Maybe, maybe not. It's not entirely clear. But we know that a tradition of sumo wrestling was passed down for a long, long time in Japan. And then later, kind of the rules and standards were set in stone. But before that, we don't entirely know what sumo wrestling looked like. We have an idea that it's probably similar to this, but who knows? But we also know that samurai practiced forms of sumo wrestling, and samurai also practiced forms of jiu-jitsu. And during that period, it was kind of an elite thing. So only the elites got training in these martial arts, and they were dominated by larger people. So you had to be a very large person to compete in sumo, of course, and jiu-jitsu, because that's what the moves were based on, is that a larger person would defeat a smaller person always, and they had martial arts training, blah, blah, blah. And then there was a gentleman who loved martial arts. He loved jiu-jitsu, and he loved sumo wrestling. And this man's name is Kano Jigaru. And a lot of people know where I'm going with this. But Kano Jigaru studied sumo, and he studied jiu-jitsu, and he was just too small to be good at either of those. So what he did instead is devised a system where a larger man could take advantage, and he devised a system where a smaller man could defeat a larger man in a martial arts match. So he figured out the best pulls, the best throws, the best submissions, where the smaller man with martial arts training could defeat the larger man. And this system, he came to call it judo. And one of Kano Jigaru's main students was a gentleman by the name of Mitsuyu Maeda. And Mitsuyu Maeda would take the show on the road, and he would say, like, the more the better. Like, that's our attitude. It's not just for high-ranking rich people in Japan. Anyone who wants to learn judo can come and can learn it from me, Mitsuyu Maeda. And he traveled the world teaching people judo. And when he went on the road, he called this system jujitsu. Okay, so that's fine. So Kano Jigaru called it judo. Mitsuyu Maeda also believed that he was a judo professional, but when he took it on the road, he called it jiu-jitsu. That's fine. Let's not worry about that too much. So today we do have two separate things, judo and jiu-jitsu, but maybe back then they didn't see it as ultimately separate. But one of the important students of Mitsuyu Maeda is the Gracie family. So if you have a black belt today in jiu-jitsu, you can trace it directly back. You can trace that lineage back to Mitsuyu Maeda and Kano Jigaru directly. But when he was touring the world, he went to Brazil, and the Gracie family asked him to stay and teach us everything. Don't just do a quick seminar, stay here and teach us the ways. And then the Gracie family had taken what they learned from Mitsuyu Maeda. They had competed in some legendary matches here and there against other Japanese jiu-jitsu professionals like Komura, and there was other major matches like that. But yeah, the Gracie family perfected what they saw as the ultimate martial art that could defeat any other martial art. But they had to prove it. And the way to prove that was through something called the Gracie Challenge, where they said to any other martial arts professionals, come to our gym, challenge us in a no rules matchup if you are a martial arts professional. And we will show you that jiu-jitsu is better. And a lot of these are on camera and a lot of these are not on camera, but they brought like taekwondo and karate instructors and black belts to their gym, took them down and submitted them. That was the Gracie Challenge over and over again. And through that, they were able to prove that Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was the best, but they did not get much recognition internationally. And they wanted more recognition internationally for Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. So they had an idea. At the time, WWF pay-per-view wrestling was quite popular in the US. This was the early 90s. And the Gracie family wanted to prove to the world that they were the best. So they had an idea to do a pay-per-view competition tournament where different styles of martial arts would face off against one another until the ultimate style would be crowned. And this is where the origins of the UFC come from. Is that the Gracies wanted to prove that Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was the best. So UFC 1, they had sumo wrestlers. They had, boxers. They had kung fu and karate and all that stuff. And Pancrase was there as well. And ultimately they proved through that competition and then UFC 1 and 2 and blah, 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 and so on and so on. Annually, they were able to prove that Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was the best. So that is how you get on a direct timeline from ancient Shinto sumo wrestling to the UFC. And I know in telling that story, there's probably a few things that I missed. There's a few details I glossed over, and there's probably a few things maybe I got wrong. Hey, just throw them at me in the comments. We want to have a really cool, cohesive story. But make sure that we're accurate more than anything. That is just like a large overview of how you get from ancient Shinto wrestling to the UFC, and it's a pretty crazy story. But yeah, with sumo, like I'm not an expert in any way. Like I said, I am just a fan, and when interesting things are happening, I'll jump on the bandwagon and start watching again. But Takerufuji's story is just incredible. Hakuho's story is just incredible. Terunofuji's story is just incredible. Those are kind of the big guys in the last few years here. And I think so from the articles I've written about this, I keep quoting the article that I wrote in 2021, and I will put it in the comments. Sorry, I put it in the description down below for you folks and a few other things that I've written about sumo wrestling. And after that, you will be a sumo expert. Okay, so that's it for kickboxing this week. Thanks for listening to the Kickboxing podcast. If you folks are more into sumo wrestling, I'll try to cover it a little bit more in the future, but let me know if you are interested in it. I'll cover it when it's interesting and there's big things going on, but if you guys are saying like, no, that's more interesting, there's more there, I'll try to commit myself a little bit more to watching sumo wrestling, but let me know. Folks, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it greatly, and I will see you at the same time next week.